This is the Police Training HQ podcast. We are your headquarters for all things training and resources for Texas law enforcement. And welcome back to the Police Training HQ podcast, your headquarters for training and resources for Texas law enforcement. We are without Mike again this week, but we have a wonderful and special guest. Special to me, I get the pleasure and honor of calling him Uncle Bud, but to you, it is Kyle Bauer. Welcome.
Hey, thanks. Glad to be here.
Well, I'm going to get right to it because we're not paying you for this, so we're gonna. Yeah, I got some questions, and a lot of it stems from, as we'll get into, our relationship, you helping me in my career in education. But I know there was times before that. I, however, have a very selfish question that I want to ask you, something I've been dying to do. So, almost 20 years ago, I took the leap and became a cop, and I've always been curious of what your reaction was to that, or hearing that news.
Well, first off, great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I had to stop and think about my first reaction was probably responding to the boy I knew growing up. And I thought, oh my God, he's going to hurt somebody. Because I remember with your attention that sometimes I remember when you were learning to drive, for example, and you would be driving down the road and I would say something to you. And when I did, you would look over at me and take your eyes off the road. And I'm like, look back at the road, look back at the road. And so when I first heard that you were going to be an officer, that was the kid I was picturing with a gun. And then, of course, I realized that you've grown up since that memory. And I thought more about the job of a police officer and became very proud of your choice because we come from a family of people who served in the military, who served society and served, in other ways like teaching and social work and that, and realized that you had that keen awareness of people around you. You had a sense of justice and fairness. And I realized that actually was an excellent choice for you, is to go into that field where you could use some of your natural skills. So that was my final thought on it, was good choice. How lucky we are to have somebody who wants to, carry out this service and keep us safe in this world.
I thank you for that. Yeah. Well, officially I was on patrol by myself, so nobody ever got to ask for my attention ever. Maybe that was why I was successful. I thank you. That's really nice. I have been dying, but I keep forgetting to ask you that, and so I'm very, very grateful for that. As we're going to talk about your connection with education and your career, I want to get all into that as much as you're willing to share. From your experiences, however, what part of your upbringing or early adulthood rather influenced your decision to get into education, or at this point?
It actually goes back to childhood, and I never had a lot of athletic prowess, and academics seemed to be one way that I could, have an identity and be successful at something. Also, on my mom's side of the family, a lot of educated people, and they were just very curious, interested people who would always get out the encyclopedia to look something up. And so there was just that air or that family value of education. And one of the things I loved about education that was not like anything else in my world at the time was I only competed against myself. And so I didn't feel like I was going to lose out to anybody else. If I worked hard enough, I could make the accomplishment happen. Nobody was going to beat me at it. And then I was able to earn the grades and then, have that feeling of esteem that comes from, doing your own work. And so that was really the very early on positiveness of it. And then I did not know at the time that I would become a lifelong learner. I've taken the GRE 3 times in my life. not because I failed it the first time, but because about every 10 years when it expires, I decide it's time to go back to school again. So I just have this natural compulsion. I think it roots all the way back to, it's something that's in my control. It's something that I can be successful with. And then and with the family value of just loving to learn and know the facts, is that all those things together kind of come together to give me this really powerful value towards education.
That's great. Yeah, as far as back as I can remember, education, academics. I mean, even as a kid, I saw books in your house, and I always or even just on your coffee table, I have memories of that. And I used to tell my parents, hey, he reads, almost as a descriptive, like he reads, and they're like, you want to watch some TV,
Yeah.
I mean, kind of a different thing.
Even when I was 14, 15 years old, to go to the library, I would go and get library books on how the brain works. I always had kind of that sciencey side, or more, I wasn't as interested in fiction and storytelling as I was in facts and science and that angle of it too. So probably part of how I'm wired also contributes to, my interest in education, is because I'm interested in facts and knowing how things work.
Well, for the audience and those that know Mike and I think, especially me, that's dead on the money. People will know we're related now.
Yeah.
Don't tell me. No, don't tell me.
I'm proud of that.
I am too. I'm very proud of it. It's going to lead in later, but your help, I think, pushed us towards this brain science approach that Police Training HQ, I think, is starting to kind of get our head around, no pun intended, get our brain around, trying to use these techniques in the classroom. But another question: if you weren't going to do education and you had a long and esteemed career as an interpreter as well, interpreter education, what would you have done? Curious.
So if I wasn't in the world of interpreting or education, I might have gone towards the lawyer thing, just because I like the facts. Like you, I sort of leaned into justice and fairness. And so I think legal might have been. I also like minutia detail, trying to find the little ins and outs and ways that you can bring somebody down or build them up based on just the little nuances that you pick up on and then build into your case or whatever. So attorney would have been one. I also always loved the sciences, and forensic science would have been another one. I'm, big true crime person, and the fiction books I do read all involve murder. And so, I do like that forensic side of it. So that would probably have been another area that I would have looked at.
That's
seriously.
cool. And, I worked for the DA's office for a long time, part of my career. Would you have been a prosecutor, or do you think defense work would have been? Is that a fair question?
Fair question, prosecutor. Right. I just, having been a legal interpreter and having seen, worked on and had to be a communicator for both sides of it, and I just always lean in towards the, law enforcement. I just believe in law enforcement. And I would hate to use if I was skilled as an attorney, to use them to find ways to get people off when I knew that they were guilty. I appreciate the fact that everybody deserves representation, but I would not want to be the one who, it would feel wily or dirty to me to try to find ways to get people off if I thought that they were guilty. So I would have stayed on the prosecutor side and just been poor my whole life.
It's true. Very, very. I think the defense bar would be terrified in Texas had you become a prosecutor. You'd probably been kicking their butts all up and down the state. So there's no doubt about that. I want to start getting a little bit of background, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I know that you had a long career, and if you don't mind talking about some of your, I know, ever since I can remember, you taught us how to sign "Do not play in the kitchen." So as long as I have a memory, you've been signing. Does it go back that far in the 90s, 80s?
Well, growing up, because of the medical side of my mom's family, there were a lot of, doctors and psychiatrists and dentists and just a whole bevy of those people. And I was pre-programmed all through growing up that I would be an MD. And my family would send me when I was 10, 12, 15 years old, my birthday cards would say Dr. Buddy Bauer on it. So they brainwashed me into it. So when I got into college, I was a pre-med. I was oriented towards pre-med, took sciences and physics and chemistry and liked it pretty good. I mean, it sort of spoke to me a bit. But as I was coming into my young adult, 19, 20 years old, I started thinking, whose dream was this? Whose idea was it for me to be medical? Where am I getting this from? And when I stopped and looked at the people in my family who were medical people, I didn't really jive with them. I didn't think I had that personality. And so I could kind of feel myself leaning away from it or trying to redefine it. I looked at physical therapy and respiratory therapy and other avenues besides the MD level. And it just so happened at the same time my mom wanted to be a sign language interpreter. And so she would go to college with me, which was a great big drag. To have your mom follow you to college, right? She's like, get out of here. I just graduated from high school. My turn to be independent.
Yes.
But she came to college with me. She was learning sign language, and then we would go home and study. And it stuck with what her sign language. I would help her study, and it spoke to me. No pun intended. It just there was just something about the language that really seemed to work in my brain. That the visual kinetic part of it. And I started hanging out with deaf people, and it came so naturally to me that I was hanging out with deaf people, and I would look around my apartment on a Friday night, and there would be 10 deaf people and me, the only hearing person in there. And so I became part of that culture, and that was sort of the beginning. And I, again, at that time in the 70s when I was learning in that place, interpreting was not a profession. And so you really couldn't make a living off of it. But my deaf friends would say, come and interpret with me for this, or interpret for me with this, or come over here and do that. And so I would start picking up odd jobs doing interpreting. Fell in love with it. I heard myself talking about it one day, and I was talking up really high, low. I could hear in my voice that this was my calling.
That was it.
And I spent the next 20 years just, lock, stock, and barrel into everything I could learn about being an interpreter.
And you were one of few legal interpreters in Texas at one point, or maybe for a long time. You're certified legal interpreter, sorry to say, yeah.
Yeah, I have a specialty in legal, which was, pretty uncommon at the time, and advanced so much in that area and took college classes and paralegal kinds of things that I became a mentor for I was a certified mentor to certify other interpreters to become legal. Cool. So legal became a really big, fun deal for me. And so, and of course, as a community interpreter, it's really hard to explain. It's so varied that you can get up in the morning and go to the IRS office and do a staff meeting, and then you can go and do this one-on-one doctor's meeting with an 80-year-old man who needs a colonoscopy, and then you go over to the post office and you do their union meetings, and then you go and the variety was so wild and so all over the place that it was so exciting to do. And you get exposed to all this stuff. And as a lifelong learner, I also, every place I went, I would do an asbestos training for a day. Well, so I got to learn all about asbestos without having to take the test. And then the next day I would be in court. And so it was just exciting work like that.
Life hack.
Yeah,
kind of life hack a little bit. Yeah, that's awesome.
Good way to put it.
Yeah, and I do remember, several occasions that we would talk about some of the cases even, and how nuanced it is and how technical, because, we've talked about things like Miranda, and the communication style you have to have is so technical. You police officers think so, but I don't think they have an idea of how on point you have to be.
I think a lot of people think of interpreters as taking one word and putting it into another language. And what we really have to do is work on ideas. We have to get into your head. What are you trying to say? What is the Miranda warning? What are they saying? What do they mean? Not what are the words. And so that's the technical part of it that a lot of people don't realize. That becomes the fun mental gymnastics challenge of it. It's just, how can I figure out how to say this, in such a way so that I'm communicating the idea, not just trying to get words out there.
It's fascinating. And you are, for the benefit of our audience, and you can believe me, you are the best communicator I know, hands down, in many ways. I'm trying to learn to be better. Do you think that influenced you at all? Sort of your love for communication, linguists or paralinguistics and all that you study, to get into that education side, to kind of transition in and start to kind of want to teach others to communicate effectively, either through interpreting or...
I think it's a big part of it. I can remember even when I was young that my parents would have an argument, and I could hear both sides of it. Like logically, I'd be like, but that's really, you're getting mad, but that's really what they're trying to say. And so I always had that intuition for understanding what people were trying to communicate. So that was kind of the beginning of why I think interpreting really pulled me in, was because it tapped into a natural ability that I had to understand two sides. And then becoming an interpreter, as I described a minute ago with all the different scenarios, to be a neutral party in these contexts of trying to understand if I'm in a lawyer's office and this defendant needs help or needs an attorney, that I get to study and watch and observe all the different types of communication, the different types of people and how they communicate, poorly, well, whatever it is. And so I've been able to be in the communication context without having to be the communicator. So I could listen and study and say, like, wow, they're really saying that in a screwy way. I can interpret that clearer. And so I was able to sit in a neutral capacity as opposed to being the person in the hot seat who is doing the communicating. And I could, in my own way, study how they said that and what was it about the tone that sent them off, the other person off in the other direction. And so, I just had thousands of hours of being able to study and be a part of communications from that neutral, detached, but invested level.
Yeah, and I don't want to make a mistake of vocabulary. I know that you've trained and studied and learned, and there's so many hours that I just remember all the conversations we had, and you picked it up over time. And so when I said you are the best communicator, it's because you've worked so hard at it. I mean, it's the passion will be obvious. I mean, to me, it's always has been. And I've always thought maybe I hope I could be as passionate about something, and I think I've found mine, and it kind of starts with this education thing. Now, not to say that I've wasted time as a cop, that's not. I mean, they're synonymous with each other, but in that the way that you've studied and you've learned your styles and different styles and the way to pick up. Do you think that helps you now that you've sort of transitioned into maybe education and in the training world? I know you did some too earlier, talking about asbestos training, and did that help kind of launch you into your love for education now? And
I think so. I think it's probably what contributes to me being a good educator, is because, again, I've been able to sit back. It's like having a laboratory. I was able to sit back and watch these communication events, and I could tell by the way people sat in their chair, head behind their desk, crossed their legs, looked off when other people were talking, and how it would be off-putting in some way. And so I think in terms of the way I connect with students and connect with the classroom has a lot to do with that learned experience from all those hours, thousands of hours of observation, and being the communicator in the middle of it without having to come up with the words. Like I was just taking other people's ideas and trying to understand how to convey it. So I think that did contribute a lot to my success in education. But like I said before, I have my own natural love for learning. I've never taught children. I've done some high school classes a little bit, but mine has always been adults. And when I first started, I was a trainer. I did interpreter skills trainings. And so in my mind, it was a collegiate experience. So I wasn't Mr. So-and-so up in the front of the room. These were my colleagues and my buds and people. And I was studying linguistics and then bringing it. And we were kind of like, chatting about it, talking about it, sharing it. It wasn't like a formal education, like I had to worry about testing and worry about this stuff. It was just a bunch of colleagues sharing and interacting. And so that became my role as a teacher, is I don't want to be your teacher. I don't want to be the authority. And I've always been a big constructivist for that reason. I don't want to tell you anything you already know. You tell me what you know, and then we can build upon it. And so that's that constructivist idea. And but I do think it all comes from my watching how other people communicated, and then thinking that I could find those links, plus being an enthusiastic learner myself. And I think that's probably what I get most credited for, is that when I do training, is that they say, you seem so enthusiastic, you really seem like you enjoy what you're doing. And that's the secret to it. That's the secret sauce, I think.
That's amazing. And so, I mean, on that, if you don't mind kind of telling do you have something you could say is the most rewarding part, just kind of as a general statement about teaching and training and education in general, as you as the teacher's role?
I went from being a trainer, which was doing the skills kind of training in that. And that was so much fun. It was, like I said, collegiate, and we were sharing ideas, and you could have personality and interact with the crowd, and you knew you wouldn't see them tomorrow. So it had that nice, casualness about it, I guess. Yeah. And then I got into, I started the Austin Community College Interpreter Training Program, and I became the director. And then all of a sudden I had to worry about not just, did we have a good day today? Did you learn the skills I put out there? But I've got you for 2 or 3 years. I have to grow you into a professional. And not only do I have to worry about your skills, I have to worry about how you dress and how you represent. And then that became the difference in me between training and being an educator, where I had to worry about more than just the content itself, but about the outcome. And so that's where my pride came in, was when I would graduate somebody who would then go out and get their certification and go into the work world. And that was my pride, was that I got them, from A to Z, the full circle, or the whole shebang of becoming a well-rounded professional interpreter, and not just did I teach you any new skills today. And so that's the rewarding part, is seeing people who are passionate about what they want to do go out and become successful at it. Big buzz.
So huge buzz. I'd buy a gram of it if I could. I honestly, there's also a phrase you taught me that represents that very well. The aha to.
From aha to ta-da.
Yeah, I didn't really talk about that, but that is that buzz, I think, in a phrase that when you see adults start from aha to ta-da.
Yeah, and just real quick is, aha is I understand what you're trying to tell me, and ta-da is, look, I've been able to apply what you told me into making it something applicable, tangible, and so that's the aha to ta-da, is it's seeing it more than, because I can stand up there with a PowerPoint and I can check off everything that was on the list, or I can see it to fruition and say, okay, now you show me back what you just learned, and then I see it. That's the ta-da! Look what I learned.
Oh yeah, and I actually borrowed that. Trademark? Is it trademarked?
It should be. It is now.
It is now, right? Yeah. Well, all the basic instructors, we talk about that, and I think it becomes a live and living color moment, because it is. Unfortunately, sometimes in law enforcement education, you don't see it very often. Perhaps it takes a few days until they have their ta-da. And so I think well that Mike and I, we try to have that quicker. We try to maybe tap into whatever neurochemistry or whatever we can to get a student quicker to the ta-da, at least in the working memory space.
Yeah, and I also wouldn't think of it as though it has to be aha and then it all ends in a ta-da. I think what you're suggesting is a great idea, is that you can have incremental ta-das. Like, here's some information, now give me back what, or teach back, or whatever it is, and then you show me that, ta-da. Okay, not ta-da, we're finished, but you got that idea into a place where you own it now as the learner. And now we can go to some new information of aha, and then ta-da. And so I think the idea of what you're saying is to do it incrementally. And don't think that it all ends in a ta-da, but that you have those along the way as benchmarks.
Absolutely. And for us, we're studying it currently, but you have some brain-based learning knowledge and ideas that you've shared with me for years. Where did that come from? Where did you start? I know you mentioned you liked books on the brain, and that must be just a kind of a collection of years of learning, like a lifelong learner, in learning specifically, or education.
Well, when I first got into studying education some, I thought an awful lot about your dad, my brother, because he and I were completely opposite learners. He was so kinetic and so, attention deficit. That's not the right word. He was never diagnosed, but, he was just hyper in class, and that was not a great learning environment for him. As opposed to me, who could sit there in class still and listen and take in and feel engaged in some way. And then somewhere along the way, of course, your brother is smarter than I always was. He just wasn't as academic as I was, but much smarter. And I realized that. And so I started trying to understand what's the difference between him and I. And that turned me into that multimodal, or, your preferred way of learning. Are you a kinetic learner? Are you a that? And I think that's a lot of what started some of my interest in the science of learning, or the brain chemistry, or the brain part of it. And I think it came from understanding and realizing that some people are right brain, some people are left brain, some people like audio, some people, and that once I got my brain into that, trying to develop ideas about how you bring that into the classroom.
Yeah, I appreciate you talking about that. I think I am him as a learner. I'm very, very ADHD, and I tell students that so that way they can feel better about maybe if they're struggling it. Because I sort of see it, I understand it.
I'm so glad you share it, because I think if somebody would have let that into your dad's world too and said, some people are different and learn different and try it this way, it would have made all the difference in the world. What was so sad about that is because he came out as a failure in high school. People saw him as being a goof off and a failure. And for somebody to be so smart and to be seen that way, and it affected his self-esteem and how he saw himself. And it's just, this is one of the indictments against teachers, is that teachers can actually ruin, that's not maybe the right word, but they can scar a student or a learner by making them think that they're stupid because you're not learning the way I'm showing you. When in fact, if the teacher had a multimodal approach and could reach them in a different way, you might be surprised that that person that you thought was stupid is really smart once you find their path into how to get it, into their cognition in some way.
Yeah, no, for those that listen to our podcast, that's what we try to offer, is that there is a way that has been sort of the norm in law enforcement education, that paramilitary structure that you're studying currently, but it's not the way. It's just a way, and it's been a way for a long time. I would argue it's not a great way. That's what Mike and I kind of stand on, and we preach, not to your point of not trying to indict our profession or the legitimacy of being a law enforcement educator, but most of what we have to teach or the things that are up for topic, I guess any block of instruction in law enforcement, because sometimes they're small and large or whatever, but it tends to be practical. I mean, most what Mike and I talk about is there is a practical application for darn near 90% of what we're teaching, because we have to use it in the field, and that changes everything. In schools, like in high school, when you were a high school teacher, did you find there were sort of young adults at that point, and then on into when you were teaching adults? Was there a big difference between that sort of young adult brain to the fully formed brain or adult brain?
Yes. Well, one of the biggest differences in that between like a secondary and post-secondary is because, kids are in high school against their will. So you automatically have that motivational, impediment that, they're there whether they want to be or not. When you teach adults, most of the time, unless it's a work requirement or something like that, most of the time the adults are there because they want to learn or they have some other motivation, and they're not being forced with a gun to their head or a truancy officer to their head to keep them in school. And so that was a big difference. And then the other thing too is to break the schema when you're working with young people who come in and fall into their habitual, they plop into their chair and they wait to receive and they wait for you to, and to try to shake up that schema was a challenge, because if I let them sit there behind their books and just have me up there, pedantically, blah, 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 they fall into this receptive role that's not engaged, that's not in any way using any critical thinking skills. And so that to me is the biggest challenge. Whereas adults, because they're there, they want to be there, they're more apt to engage their own curiosities and try to pursue what they're there for. As opposed to the kids who are just like, what am I here for? You tell me. Mm-hmm. Adults can tell you why they're there. Young people won't be able to.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that in law enforcement too, where it's a check the box training because I have to have this mandated course sometimes. Do you find there's a big difference in engaging the students emotionally, so that way delivering content that kind of sticks cognitively? Adults sort of respond to that. I think it's up in the air a little bit. I guess I should say more in the instructional design space, because I'm bouncing. This is why I'm ADHD, I guess. Yeah. But how do you balance that? I mean, you have that the common schema. Maybe adults do want to be there a little bit more. We tend to see that too. But like in the academy, I'm sure it can feel like they're trapped as well. Do you use like students like an emotional connection to help deliver content that sticks cognitively? Is that part of your schema breakup?
Well, the flip side to that description between the secondary and post-secondary is that young people are also once you get into adulthood, you have sort of set your personality in a way so that you protect your weaknesses, and you have your the way you've built your identity, so that adults are more difficult to engage emotionally, in that they're already set in their ways, and they don't, like some people don't want to be called on in class, right? Young people are more used to being called on, whether they want to be or not. So they're not quite as set in their ways. So in some way you can lead them easier. And if you're a little more enthusiastic, or you shake up the schema a little bit, the young people will respond to it quickly. And, and that seems to really engage them. Whereas an adult, you may try a different approach to it in some way, and it may or may not speak to them because they're so set in their way. So in a way, you have to kind of play a broader field, and you have to be multimodal in the true sense of kinesthetic. And you look and see, when you ask somebody, who thinks blah, 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 and then you gauge who doesn't raise their hand or who doesn't participate, that they're a certain kind of learner. And then the person who immediately says, oh, I know the answer to this one, they're a certain kind of learner. When it gets to the adult side of that, you really have to play all sides. Oh, yeah. With young learners, you don't have to do that as much. They'll all tend to come together without having to play each individual difference.
Yeah, that's really, that's been our experience. I'm so thankful. We ask these sort of questions all the time, and most experience is sort of paramilitary, but then to your point, I know you taught at Sul Ross recently, and that's what's been reported is, they may be a little set in their ways, but we're having them up. You're doing activities with them, and we catch a little bit of flack sometimes every so often from usually a captain that's probably a couple years away from retirement. I have to get up and do a demonstration or whatever.
And that's what I was speaking to too, is that they're so set in their ways that, it's a little bit harder to break them out of that set, as opposed to young people. And what you've described to me, and as far as how you're getting people to get up and do things and that, you really are giving them a multimodal approach that they may not have ever had before. So I can imagine sometimes they're going to be a little apprehensive. Like, he wants me to get up there and teach the class. But I would imagine if you asked them at the end of the day, how did that go? I think they would really have gotten a buzz out of it. Like, they had to break through that barrier of letting go of what they thought was, how they should represent. And
I think that is the common experience. We always ask, and it wasn't that bad, was it? And no, it wasn't that bad. It was fun. You could tell there was a little bit of a beam, a glow.
And then the next day, you'll oftentimes see that person participate more in class. So you got two of them. You got in there somewhere and broke through the schema and their set ways, and you had them do this thing that was out of their comfort zone. And tomorrow they're going to be a different learner because you've gotten to them.
That's right.
Connected.
That's right. And with that, if you don't mind, do you mind if we transition a little bit to the law enforcement stuff? Because for the benefit of the audience, I have asked you for years these questions of, gosh, how do I deal with this many learning objectives? And I think you've become aware sort of the sheer volume, let's say specifically for the academy, for instance, that Mark and I teach at a lot. Do you have an opinion of that, the sheer volume of information, these 1,000 learning objectives?
It's not just the number of objectives. It is the number of objectives in a certain amount of time, in the allocation of time that you have. I mean, let's face it, if you're going to be an accountant, you're going to go through a 4-year degree and learn your CPA. You're going to learn a lot more objectives than these that you've got in the police academy. But they got 4 years to learn them and memorize and inculcate and problem solve with them and apply them. Whereas in the limited amount of time that you have, I think it's beyond cumbersome to try to expect someone to be able to absorb that much. And I think it's incumbent on the educational system, your academy or the instruction, for them to organize it so that the learner can figure out, what do I really need to know to get out of here? Which one of these items are foundational to other pieces, so that I can start organizing it in a way? Because when it comes to learning, you want people to learn the broader concepts first, and then the more specifics and the details built on top of that. If you throw everything at somebody with the main concept and all the details that support it and all that stuff in one breath or in one lesson, it's hard for them to organize which parts of this make up what part, how do they all interconnect in some way. And so I think that's incumbent when you have this many objectives, is for the instruction to be organized in a way to help them digest, knowing it's impossible in that amount of time to have learned all of those. Well, what do you want me to learn out of it? You already know by your passing score that you only have to have 75% of the knowledge. Right? Is that what a passing score is?
Yeah, in our academy, 75.
So, I mean, you're sending the message that I'm going to give you a lot of information, but you only have to know 75% of it. So you're already sending that message by telling me that's the pass rate. So now it will tell me which part of the 75, you just gave me 15,000 points. Yeah. Which part of these are the ones that I really need to be more focused on or not? And I think it's unfair, or at least, I think it's unfair to give a student all those points and not give them enough guidance to organize it in a way so that they can say, hey, I can become more familiar with this later after I graduate. This is what I need to know to get out on the streets.
Yeah, my brain started kind of spinning a little bit, because you're right. There is that push. It feels, I need to know all this right now. And that's irrational. Even at 70%, that's 10,500 learning objectives. Yeah. You don't know what 10,000. Because 1,000 of those could have came from hazmat. And I think that's the wrong service, personally.
And then how much of your day do you actually spend doing hazmat on the job? So again, it has to be proportioned out. And if hazmat is in a required area, couldn't that be taught after they graduate and get through the basics? And then, again, the timeline that y'all are doing your training in is really the most in need of reform.
I agree.
It's specifically amount of time spent, in the classroom, and that if you only have this many hours, what can reasonably be accomplished? Yeah, well,
and part of that, what you've helped me with the most, is psychometrics, like testing and understanding how to be more intentional and measure data and things of that nature. And do you think it would be, I don't want to say valid or invalid, maybe you can help me with that, but is it an invalid way to have that much information, the volume, and then to have one test at the end of it? I mean, that seems like a really unfair test, or some way invalid test, to just randomize 10,000 points spread across a 43 topic syllabus, and then to say, there you go, that's going to determine whether or not you get a license or not. And it seems difficult to process in my brain that that's somehow valid.
It seems that kind of a design sounds like it was built by somebody who doesn't really understand how the human brain works, learns, how memory works. Because when you're building a valid test, you have to be very clear on your objectives. What am I trying to measure from this test, right? So it ties back into your lessons. The test should reflect the lessons. And so the construct of the test is based on that. Okay, so now you've given me 15,000 objectives. Is that really what you expect people to have? Do you expect them to have all that by the end of this training? Because if so, then your test is fine. What you're doing is fine, because it's valid in that my expectation was for you to know all of this. Here's a test to see if you know all of this. That makes it valid. Now, it gets into reliability when you talk about, are you failing people who would have been really good on the job? If so, then it's an unreliable design, because you're losing people who should be out there on the field, and you've lost them for these academic, because you haven't organized your instruction or the testing in a way to draw out those people who are good. And again, I really think it needs to be leveled. I think you need to have your basic, get in there and learn enough to get out on the streets. And then when it comes to specialty stuff, and you would have to define these better than me, but hazmat's a really good example of something that could be learned, or here's a resource in boot camp basic getting into the academy. Here's a resource on that. You will do more professional development on this later. But if you need it between then and now, here's a resource. In the meantime, there'll be more training later. And to organize your curriculum in a way so that it gives people building blocks and not this assault of all this information where nothing stands out as being more important than anything else. There has to be a taxonomy or an organization to it.
Yeah, and we definitely do. I mean, there seems to be core, topics. We call them the 7 core. And we know that they're tested, that they have a greater amount of questions in those areas. We know exactly how many. and it's pretty consistent throughout. And so those happen to be those skills that they need coming out of the academy that trainers want for on-the-job training or FTO to have these basic skills in recognizing offenses and being able to arrest and search without, violating rights.
So are those 7 something that's part of the Police Academy's design or something that you all designed?
Police Academy's design as it sort of comes to us from the state. Now,
So it has an internal organization to it. Yeah, well, that's what I'm talking about is, I haven't seen it, but, that type of organization, even that is going to help, of course, too. But even within each one of those 7 units is how many objectives do you have? And, that's where you got to get into more levels of detail and trying to decide what they need to know to get out the door and then what they should be picking up on learning later. Like interpreting or like if you get your LPC in counseling, the day you get your certification to do those things is not the day you've arrived, it's the day that you get to start learning on the job. But the learning comes for the next decade afterward. And I think if we realize that a lot of the vocational training that we do, especially like Police Academy or interpreting, that we're not giving them everything they need, we have to give them the basics, knowing that the next 5 years are going to be so determinative in how informed and how educated they are in their field. And if you could incorporate that in, then you can start extracting out of your curriculum, what do I need to get them out the door, knowing that in the next 5 years, they will confront hazmat, they will confront these other more unique things, and have it organized in a way so that you're meeting the basic needs, getting them trained and good and ready and effective out on the job day one, and then let them worry about picking up more of the specifics and the details and that later, and really make it a leveled, or especially when you're only working with 700 and how many hours?
736.
736. That's a very limited amount of time to put all this information together, and so give them more repetition and more good solid foundation that they can build on later, and then with resources and stuff like you guys are developing for future development. And I think that type of incentivizing somehow so that they have to learn more later, like with the CE systems.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we could. I'd love to do this all night. Unfortunately, I have 2 more questions that I'd like to ask you. One specifically about Police Training HQ. I've pretty much brought you along the way for free without a retainer, free advice. Got time for a call, kind of, and I always appreciate it. From what you know about Police Training HQ, I mean, do you think Mike and I are doing some really cool things as far as revolutionary, or if it's different, or whatever your opinion is of that?
Well, it seems like you're really breaking out of the mold for one thing, which is kudos. I mean, one of the things we know is that, instructors tend to teach the way they were taught. And we know that nowadays people learn differently. The way we learned was not the ideal or the best ways to do it. And you guys you've blown my mind with some of the things that you've uncovered, in terms of the brain science and how you apply it to what you're doing. And I think what you're doing is pretty revolutionary in your field, because it does seem so dry and pedantic and PowerPoint driven, point by point, 15,000 objectives. And you guys are just like burning the script and just like, we're going to do that, but we're going to do it this way, where y'all are going to get up here and teach it, or we're going to mind map and draw it out in some way. And these are the things that we know. I mean, I can show you the research that says these ways of stimulating the learner, engaging them and getting them to use higher level cognitive works better for their brain as far as learning goes, the memory and retention of things. It excites them more. They get enthusiastic. And those are the preliminaries. If you want a lifelong learner, those are the things you want to get in place, is that kind of enthusiasm about learning. And I think you guys are doing that extraordinary. I mean, I think you're really, rising way above to try to discover and make those things happen. And I really think that you guys have something to offer that could really revolutionize it, really could change Police Academy, and also when they get out in the field, how they perform their job and their legitimacy. I think would be more reinforced and more solid based on you guys' curriculum.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and again, I've always greatly appreciated your advice. I've called you for a number of things, some pretty wacky. Hey, this idea, you think I can implement that? Does that sound great? You're like, well, give it a shot. I mean, you've always been our biggest supporter. And with that, like I said, I'd love to do this all night, and this is going to be gold for everybody listening. So I, again, appreciate it. Do you have any advice for instructors? I mean, Mike and we typically teach instructor development. We try to bring instructors along. Do you have any advice for law enforcement instructors coming into the biz, and any one-liners, or hey, keep it up, or?
Well, when we first started talking about this, and you were talking about teaching the teachers, and I came up with that idea of a presentation called "You Teach Like Your Mama." And it is a funny backhanded slur way of saying, you need to stop and revisit what your teaching approach is, because if you don't stop and think about it, if you don't make it conscious, if you don't come to terms or understanding of how people learn and what some of the science is behind some of that stuff, you're just going to be a robot who's carrying out the same functions as you grew up doing, but that does not inspire, and we know that's not effective, like we were talking about with your dad and my brother. That way of teaching, the old-fashioned way, like your mama, doesn't work. And so I think becoming aware of different learners, and then the other part of that is learning styles. Is that everybody has a different way of learning, and that if you go in there with this one way of approaching it every day, you're failing at the job. You can't do that and expect everybody in the room to be getting the same benefit, because everybody learns in a different way. And so understanding that your teaching is old-fashioned, and that it's probably causing everybody to fall into these preconceived roles of who I am in the schema as the learner or the student. And then the other part of it is recognizing that some people are kinetic, and if they're fidgety at their desk, then find something for them to stand up and do while you're still teaching. So I think those are the two basic pieces of advice I would suggest, especially for adult learners.
Well, thank you. And we're going to have you back on, I hope, if you'll do it. If
It'll cost you.
Yeah. You hear that, Mike? So want to thank everybody for tuning in. Should have a couple episodes coming up soon. If you enjoyed it, comment. I'll share with Uncle Bud all the comments on the videos. He'll see it himself, I hope. And thank you. Stay safe. Train hard.